Coming back at long last with a continuation of Freud's A Child is Being Beaten. Uh, my channel by no means has many views, but this video from 6 months ago, when I read the first two parts, has the most views of any of my videos, probably because the name of the essay is so provocative. A child is being beaten. Um, but I just, like to keep going with it, keep reading. I don't know how much I'll read today. It's kind of, I wouldn't say it's a long essay, but for Freud, of Freud's essays, it is somewhat longer than than others for sure. For sure. So we'll keep going, and starting with part three, I'm reading from the standard edition of the complete works, which and the original the original edition. There is a recently released um, revised edition, which I have not read yet. I'd be interested in reading it, but this is the original text. So let's just keep reading. This is page 183, volume 17 of the standard edition. Sigmund Freud, A Child is Being Beaten, published in the year 1919. Just for some historical context for people that might not be as familiar with Freud or are just getting interested in Freud. In the standard edition, I said this is volume 17. Volume 15 and 16 are the introductory lectures to psychoanalysis. And I kind of mark that the before and after of those lectures can be viewed as the early Freud, or like the first half of Freud, and then the second half of Freud. And so in 1920, so the next year after this is published, he will publish the very important work Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he introduces the death drive. And so the idea that there's I call it the libidinal drive. Freud does not use that term, but there's a drive for based on libido, and then there's a drive, a death drive. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud will say eros versus the death drive, or eros versus thanatos. But the eros to me is more of the historical unfolding of the drive, and so to give it a name that relates to the drive itself and to match this term, the death drive, I call it the libidinal drive, which I think is makes perfect sense. So it's not until 1920 that this later Freud drive theory comes into being. Earlier on, there's actually two earlier permutations of drive theory for Freud. I am not an expert on them because I associate myself with the later Freud. I'm very knowledgeable of the death drive and the libidinal drive and how those work. But one of the permutations, I can't remember if it's the first or the second, it's basically that there is this libidinal drive, or it's a sexual drive for human beings, and then there's a drive for self-preservation. And so a lot of Darwinian type theorists will associate Freud with that, or drive theorists in general will kind of cling to that. And even though Freud went on to have this other bipolar drive theory, I would say it's not as recognized and hasn't really permeated as much in the culture, even though it's much more apparently correct to me. But my main point in the context of A Child is Being Beaten is that even though this is published before Beyond the Pleasure Principle, you can kind of view this essay as getting to the later Freud. Like I said, this is the first volume of the complete works published after the introductory lectures, and so this is kind of pointing the direction for how we should understand Freud in his later period, or I would call it his mature period. Of course, the idea of the death drive really split the psychoanalytic community and people who were influenced by psychoanalysis. Wilhelm Reich, for example, rejected the idea of the death drive, whereas Deleuze would call Beyond the Pleasure Principle the most philosophical of all of Freud's writings and perhaps his masterwork. And so there's really a division between the two sides. But anyway, that's just a little historical context. So let's get back to A Child is Being Beaten, part 3, starting on page 183 of volume 17 of the Standard Edition. Strictly considered, and why should this question not be considered with all possible strictness, analytic work deserves to be recognized as genuine psychoanalysis only when it has succeeded in removing the amnesia which conceals from the adult his knowledge of his childhood from its beginning, that is, from about the 2nd to the 5th year. This cannot be said among analysts too emphatically or repeated too often. The motives for disregarding this reminder are indeed intelligible. It would be desirable to obtain practical results in a shorter period and with less trouble. But at the present time, theoretical knowledge is still far more important to all of us than therapeutic success, and anyone who neglects childhood analysis is bound to fall into the most disastrous errors. The emphasis which is laid here upon the importance of the earliest experiences does not imply any underestimation of the influence of later ones, but the later impressions of life speak loudly enough through the mouth of the patient, while it is the physician who has to raise his voice on behalf of the claims of childhood. It is in the years of childhood between the ages of 2 and 4 or 5 that the congenital libidinal factors are first awakened by actual experiences and become attached to certain complexes. The beating fantasies which are now under discussion show themselves only towards the end of this period or after its termination. So it may quite well be that they have an earlier history, that they go through a process of development, that they represent an end product and not an initial manifestation. This suspicion is confirmed by analysis. A systematic application of it shows that beating fantasies have a historical development which is by no means simple, and in the course of which they are changed in most respects more than once, as regards their relation to the author of the fantasy, and as regards their object, their content, and their significance. In order to make it easier to follow these transformations in beating fantasies, I shall now venture to confine my descriptions to the female cases, which, since they are 4 as against 2, in any case constitute the greater part of my material. Moreover, beating fantasies in men are connected with another subject, which I shall leave on one side in this paper. Footnote 1, bracket. Freud does in fact discuss beating fantasies in men below, page 196, footnote. Their specifically feminine basis is what he probably has in mind in speaking of, quote, another subject, in bracket. In my description, I shall be careful to avoid being more schematic than is inevitable for the presentation of an average case. If then, on further observation, a greater complexity of circumstances should come to light, I shall nevertheless be sure of having before us a typical occurrence, and one moreover that is not of an uncommon kind. The first phase of beating fantasies among girls, then, must belong to a very early period of childhood. Some features remain curiously indefinite, as though they were a matter of indifference. The scanty information given by the patients in their first statement, a child is being beaten, seems to be justified in respect to this phase, but another of their features can be established with certainty, and to the same effect in every case. The child being beaten is never the one producing the fantasy, but is invariably another child, most often a brother or a sister if there is any. Since this other child may be a boy or a girl, there is no constant relation between the sex of the child producing the fantasy and that of the child being beaten. The fantasy then is certainly not masochistic. It would be tempting to call it sadistic, but one cannot neglect the fact that the child producing the fantasy is never doing the beating herself. The actual identity of the person who does the beating remains obscure at first. Only this much can be established. It is not a child, but an adult. Later on, this indeterminate grown-up person becomes recognizable clearly and unambiguously as the girl's father, and girls here is in parentheses. This first phase of the beating fantasy is therefore completely represented by the phrase, "My father is beating the child." I am betraying a great deal of what is to be brought forward later, when instead of this I say, "My father is beating the child whom I hate." Moreover, one may hesitate to say whether the characteristics of a fantasy can yet be ascribed to this first step towards the later beating fantasy. It is perhaps rather a question of recollections of events which have been witnessed, or of desires which have arisen on various occasions. But these doubts are of no importance. Profound transformations have taken place between this first phase and the next. It is true that the person beating remains the same, that is, the father. But the child who is beaten has been changed into another one, and is now invariably the child producing the fantasies. The fantasy is accompanied by a high degree of pleasure, and has now acquired a significant content, with the origin of which we shall be concerned later. Now therefore the wording runs, "I am being beaten by my father." It is of an unmistakably masochistic character. This second phase is the most important and the most momentous of all, but we may say of it in a certain sense that it has never had a real existence. It is never remembered. It has never succeeded in becoming conscious. It is a construction of analysis, but it is no less a necessity on that account. The third phase once more resembles the first. It has the wording which is familiar to us from the patient's statement. The person beating is never the father, but is either left undetermined, just as in the first phase, or turns in a characteristic way into a representative of the father, such as a teacher. The figure of the child who is producing the beating fantasy no longer itself appears in it. In reply to pressing inquiries, the patients only declare, "I am probably looking on." Instead of the one child that is being beaten, there are now a number of children present as a rule. Most frequently it is boys who are being beaten, in girls' fantasies, but none of them is personally known to the subject. The situation of being beaten, which was originally simple and monotonous, may go through the most complicated alterations and elaborations, and punishments and humiliations of another kind may be substituted for the beating itself. But the essential characteristic, which distinguishes even the simplest fantasies of this phase from those of the first, and which establishes the connection with the intermediate phase, is this: the fantasy now has strong and unambiguous sexual excitement attached to it, and so provides a means for masturbatory satisfaction. But this is precisely what is puzzling. By what path has the fantasy of strange and unknown boys being beaten, a fantasy which has by this time become sadistic, found its way into the permanent possession of the little girl's libidinal trends? Nor can we conceal from ourselves that the interrelations and sequence of the three phases of the beating fantasy, as well as all its other peculiarities, have so far remained quite unintelligible.